Hello, I'm Frank Brazel, professor of history at Manning University and a student in the PhD in History program at Liberty University. In this video series, we explore the history of Cumberland County during the colonial era and early republic. This research seeks to highlight the role of Cumberland County and of Fayetteville, its principal city, in the wider events of the American Revolution and early republic. In the second video of this series, we follow Cumberland County in an era of turmoil. On the heels of the regulator movement, which had pervaded the North Carolina backcountry, some citizens of Cumberland County began to see armed resistance as a viable option for overcoming tyranny, perceived or otherwise. Join me as we chart the role of Cumberland County and her residents, both loyalist and patriot alike, during the American Revolution. Welcome back to Cumberland County, a history.
The actual commencement of hostilities against this continent by the British troops in the bloody scene on the 19th of April last near Boston, the increase of arbitrary impositions from a wicked and despotic ministry, and the dread of instigated insurrections in the colonies are causes sufficient to drive and oppress people to the use of arms.
On June 20th, 1775, 50 men of Cumberland County drafted and signed an association stating their willingness to take up arms against Great Britain in defense of their rights. This document is known both as the Cumberland Association and the Liberty Point Resolves. The men who signed the Liberty Point Resolves in a tavern in the town of Cross Creek articulated their earnest desire for reconciliation between Great Britain and her colonies, albeit on constitutional grounds. However, the overall tone of the document would have certainly been inflammatory to British ears, as the signers indicated both their willingness to pursue a path of armed resistance and to submit to the authority of continental or provincial councils. The signers of the Liberty Point Resolves did so with a firm awareness of continental events, even referring to the battles of Lexington and Concord, wherein they clearly placed the blame upon the British regulars. A similar declaration had occurred in Mecklenburg County some weeks before, but it would be more than a year before 13 of Britain's North American colonies would declare their independence at the Second Continental Congress. As Britain sought to cling to her North American colonies, the colonies sought to establish their own governments and military bureaucracies. In the first days of 1776, the North Carolina Provincial Council of Safety concerned itself with how best to pursue armed conflict with the mother country. To this end, they began the procurement and dispersal of funds to finance North Carolina's continental forces and militias, as well as commencing recruitment efforts. An undated list of patriot officers from Cumberland County further demonstrates the mixed loyalties of the region. Based upon the structure of the document, it is evident that this is a single unit with line officers and company officers organized in groups. Presumably, this list is for a militia unit, as its commander, James Rutherford, does not appear in other records for continental units. Surely an officer of Rutherford's rank would be present on rolls of continental units. However, he was not. His lieutenant colonel, however, Alexander McAllister, has been commemorated for representing the county at the First North Carolina Constitutional Convention in Hillsborough after the war, and also for being a colonel in the Cumberland County Militia. It is McAllister who therefore confirms this role as one of militia and not of continentals. County loyalty counted for much in North Carolina units, as a court-martial from 1779 attests, when a lieutenant refused to perform his duties under anyone from a new levy of troops from another county. The names on the roster also yield one further piece of information. Many were Scots Americans. Those Highland immigrants who had been in America since before the French and Indian War no longer relied on the British government as the guarantor of their freedom, as did the newer arrivals and pension veterans. Their long-term ownership of land had caused a shift in their views of liberty and property. Others, however, remained oblivious to the divided loyalties of Cumberland County. Royal Governor Josiah Martin, who throughout the summer and fall of 1775 had remained virtually imprisoned off the North Carolina coast in the Royal Navy ship HMS Cruiser, he was convinced that former regulators and the Highlanders of the interior would serve as a rallying point for Loyalist forces in the region. Martin expected Sir Henry Clinton would arrive off North Carolina with regular troops, fresh from garrison duty in Ireland, to support a campaign to subdue the Patriots in the South. To this end, he sought support from Lord Dartmouth, Secretary of State for the Colonies, in terms of arms and of rank for himself. Glowingly, he reported,
"My latest information from the interior parts of the province, whence I have always represented to your lordship that I expected to draw my principal support, corresponds with my warmest wishes. The people called regulators, for whom I had hoped before this time to have received his majesty's pardon, to the number of between 2,000 and 3,000 men, have given me the strongest assurances of their joining the king's standard whenever they shall be called upon, although not half of them are provided with arms, and I have no doubt that much greater numbers will be found to resort to it besides the Scotch immigrants."
Martin, in his self-serving way, hoped that by facilitating the enlistment of so many troops, he would be restored to his former rank in the British Army, having sold his commission years before. He was convinced that both former regulators of the western counties and the Highlanders of Cumberland County would rally to the king's standard in their thousands. To this end, he dispatched several recruiting agents, the most successful of which were regular officers Donald MacDonald and Donald MacLeod, both veterans of the Battle of Bunker Hill. MacDonald had also been present at Culloden, a further point of historical intersection between Cumberland County and the Jacobite Rising. MacDonald dispatched MacLeod further into the backcountry and assembled Loyalist leaders at Cross Creek on February 5, 1776. Overall, however, it appeared that Governor Martin's optimism was misplaced. The Highlanders of Cross Creek and of Cumberland County reported in fewer numbers than anticipated, though they made up the majority of the forces raised at Cross Creek that February. On one hand, the disproportionate number of Highlanders joining the Loyalists indicates that when taken as a group, they had more interest in participating militarily against the Patriots. On the other hand, the response was certainly less than expected by Governor Martin, who resorted to additional offers of land grants and a remission of debts owed on rents, which would have been appealing to Highlanders who had experienced no such benefit in Scotland. During the month of February, some 1,500 Loyalists would assemble along Cool Spring Street, just a few hundred yards from where the Liberty Point resolves had been signed the previous June. Many were without muskets, instead arming themselves with their traditional Highland broadswords. As they prepared to march, another connection to Culloden would emerge. Among the Loyalists who joined the King's Standard was Allan MacDonald of Anson County. More notable was the presence of MacDonald's wife, Flora, already infamous for directly aiding the young pretender in his flight from Scotland following the disaster at Culloden. Near the banks of Cross Creek, she bid her husband goodbye, and the Loyalists set out towards a disaster of their own. The direct route to Wilmington ran south along the western bank of the Cape Fear River. However, Patriot forces under James Moore blocked the Loyalist advance at Rockfish Creek in southern Cumberland County. MacDonald's primary objective was reaching Wilmington, with the hope of linking up with Clinton and the regulars when they arrived. However, the main road south was closed to him by Moore's blocking force. A near-contemporary map from 1782 demonstrates the comparison of this road and the eventual route taken by the Loyalists. Leaving Cross Creek on February 19th, MacDonald's Loyalists worked their way south without major contact until February 27th, when they were blocked again by Patriot forces, this time at Moore's Creek Bridge. With MacDonald still in camp some distance away, MacLeod, as second in command, led an attack across the partially disassembled plank bridge and towards the Patriot entrenchments. With many of his troops armed only with broadswords, MacLeod bravely and foolishly led a charge across the bridge. He paid for his bravery with his life. Upon seeing the Highlander charge break, some of the Loyalists fled outright. In the days to follow, MacDonald, who had not been present on the battlefield, attempted to salvage what remained of his force. Cross Creek had been closed to them by a Patriot force, and MacDonald's survivors were forced to surrender. The rank-and-file Loyalists were paroled by the Patriots under the promise to no longer take up arms against them, and many returned home to Cumberland County. Governor Martin, still embarked in the Cape Fear River near Wilmington, tried to save face. In a letter to Lord Sackville, he stated,
"This event, my lord, however unlucky, I hope will justify to his majesty and your lordship my representations of the favourable dispositions of many of the king's subjects here. But for the idle deception before alluded to, by which they were taught that I was actually at Cross Creek with 1,000 regulars, and which their ready intercourse with that place as immediately detected, as the disappointment staggered their confidence, I am assured would have grafted such a force on the spirit and vigour of the Highlanders as must have been sufficient to restore peace and order in this province without the immediate aid of His Majesty's troops."
Governor Martin seems to have remained deluded regarding the loyalty of those in the North Carolina backcountry. He considered the battle to be just a little check without any extensive ill consequences. While Cumberland County would continue to provide militia service to both sides, never would it furnish the thousands of Highlanders envisioned by Governor Martin. The force under James Moore, which had blocked McDonald at Rockfish Creek and later occupied Cross Creek itself, would not remain. However, Cumberland County, and Cross Creek in particular, had a role yet to play during the Revolution. Following his Pyrrhic victory at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March of 1781, General Lord Cornwallis, now commanding British forces in the South, sought refuge at Cross Creek upon his return to Wilmington. He was disappointed by what he found there.
From all my information, I intended to have halted at Cross Creek as a proper place to refit and refresh the troops, and I was much disappointed on my arrival there to find it totally impossible. Provisions were scarce, not 4 days' forage within 20 miles, and to us the navigation of the Cape Fear River to Wilmington impracticable. For the distance by water is upwards of 100 miles, the breadth seldom above 100 yards, the banks high, and the inhabitants on either side generally hostile.
While Cornwallis admitted to the warm reception he received, he acknowledged, as had Governor Martin, that such reports of loyalty had been exaggerated. Further compounding Cornwallis's woes, there were insufficient supplies of forage available in the surrounding region, and the route to Wilmington was plagued by hostile forces. He would ultimately succeed in making his way to the coast, from where he would turn his attention to prosecuting the war in Virginia. By October of 1781, Cornwallis had been bottled up at Yorktown, which was nearing the end of a protracted siege by American and French forces. The role of Cumberland County in the war was waning, though it had not yet been reduced to insignificance. Even as Cornwallis was preparing to surrender, the Continental Army dispatched a mixed force of Continentals and militia, some 210 officers and men, under Major Thomas Hogg to Cross Creek. The officers of the force stationed under Hogg, who was a longtime Continental officer and a veteran of Valley Forge, consisted of Hogg and a Continental staff, supported by a body of junior officers drawn from the militia. They would remain stationed at Cross Creek as major operations in Virginia ceased. Cumberland County had survived the war. Its largest single contribution, the provision of Loyalist troops for the doomed broadsword charge at Morse Creek Bridge. Now, following in the tradition of the Cumberland Association, it had another role to play, this time the binding of North Carolina to the newly founded United States.